Well, we begin. It's my job to talk to you about the Silicon Valley Index, and there it is. You have it in front of you. It's available to everybody in PDF format, and you can access it on your devices. It will also be available for purchase through Amazon. But before we launch into the briefing, the very first thing that I wanted to be doing was to introduce you to this wonderful woman. This is Rachel Massaro. She is the Director of Research at the Silicon Valley Institute for Regional Studies, our research arm. She's my cherished colleague. I want you to know that Rachel is the one who has overseen the index project, and she and her team have been deep in the trenches for many, many months, putting together this project. I want to acknowledge her contributions. They're just massively gigantic. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Rachel is joined, of course, by a large team. It includes Heidi Young, it includes Ryan Young. These are subject matter experts. We also work with Steve Levy as our chief economist on the project, John Haveman, E.C. Roman, and then many others that are actually too numerous to mention, but they are listed in the Silicon Valley Index. You'll see them right there on the inside front cover. It's a large team that brings us this project every year, and we're grateful to be doing it in the spirit of teamwork and partnership. I'll also mention that these good people had a very difficult time this year getting at all of the data that we normally access because, like everything else, there's supply chain issues, and so we haven't had all of the data sets at our disposal in the same way that we ordinarily do. And so we've had to be especially creative and hard-working. And so I want to give credit to the team for that. I also want to tell you that the team has elected me to be the voice of the project today at State of the Valley. I wish they were on stage with me, but we've discussed it carefully, and they think that it's best that there's one voice, and I've been tapped to be that voice, and so I'm honored to be here in that capacity, but I'll do my best to speak on their behalf. So there it is. That, ladies and gentlemen, is that's Silicon Valley and the greater Bay Area. From outer space, it looks like such a halcyon place. And this really tells you everything you need to know. It's, you can see it's this extended landmass, a peninsula, a narrow peninsula, surrounded on three sides by water, ringed by mountains, foothills, and permanently protected open space. And everything that we will be discussing today is taking place in this fixed landmass, which is, for the most part, completely built out. So there it is. But we're going to dive really deeply to understand it. Now, one thing that I love about the index is that it tells not one story, not two stories. It tells many stories. It tells you that Silicon Valley is actually a complicated place and a multifaceted place. Here's an example of it. We briefed the media this week on this year's installment, and the media see different things. Here's the Mercury News, for example. And the story that they see coming out of it is that the job market is bouncing back, and that is true. That is a true story, and we'll talk about that in detail. But here's the Chronicle, same day, and they had the same briefing at the same time. For the Chronicle, the story is that Silicon Valley has an enormous income gap and a wealth gap. Also a true story. And so we will be exploring this, and hopefully you'll walk away understanding that Silicon Valley is many things, and it's complicated. So let's delve into those complications. I would like to begin by talking about the disease itself, the virus that has sent us onto this journey, which is now into its third year as it stretches on. So the very first thing that we should do is to talk about where we stand with respect to the disease itself. Now, here's a chart that's showing you the cases and deaths. I'd just like you to know that here are the cumulative cases. We've had roughly 400,000 cases in Silicon Valley in the way that we define it. And then there's your number of deaths, 2,677. This is as of yesterday. So these are the most updated figures. I want to say make an observation. When the pandemic set in, we were told that the virus would infect about 50% of our population. And then we were told that 4% of people who were infected would probably die. That means that we were bracing in the Bay Area for about 160,000 deaths. That did not happen for a variety of reasons, but we need to acknowledge right at the front that one reason it didn't happen is because this region decided to be aggressive in its response to the disease. Our tech companies were the very first to go sheltering in place before there were any orders issued. And of course, our health officials, including Dr. Cody and her team, were the nation's first to issue the sheltering orders. And as a result, we were immediately able to flatten the curve, and the calamity that was foretold did not actually develop. So that's a good news story. Now, this chart shows you what the disease looks like when we break it down, cases and deaths. It turns out that on the case front, it's actually our younger population that has the highest incidence of cases. And yet, our younger population is able to shake off the disease. Our older population, if you are 70 and above, you have a smaller chance of surviving the infection, and so that's where we see that's where we see it. Now we need to actually put these numbers in perspective because the raw numbers don't tell you everything. So I wanted to compare our region to the state and the nation, and so this tells you in terms of annual cases. Here's Silicon Valley with less than 3,000 annual cases per 100,000 people. Okay, and the national average is about double that. So here's our region, seemingly having a better response to the disease. Now, in 2021, it was even more dramatic as we had these additional spikes. And so there you see that our case count went up above 3,000, something like about 4,000, but again, half of the national average. Then here is the picture with deaths per 100,000 people. Again, in Silicon Valley, it looks like our death counts are less than half of the state and the national average. So that puts it into some perspective for you. But make no mistake, COVID-19 has become the third leading cause of death in Silicon Valley. If you're curious, the leading cause of death is cancer, followed by heart disease, and now in third place is COVID-19. And remember, the absolute number was about 2,800 deaths since the onset of the pandemic. Now, the key question is the vaccination. And you should know that we are a region that's vaccinated. This chart is showing you that 53% of our population is completely vaccinated, and by that we mean 2 shots and a booster, so triple vaxxed. So half of us are doing that. Another 35% had the 2 shots, the 2 vaccinations, and so that adds up to about 89%. So 89% of our population is what the health officials call fully vaccinated. When you compare that to the United States is hovering at about 68% vaccinated. So there's a marked comparison for you. Okay, that's what I wanted to say about COVID. But where I want to go from here is to talk about what COVID has meant on the jobs front. So let's jump right in. Here we go. This is a chart that's showing you that dramatic spike in unemployment that happened when the pandemic set in. And my gosh, it was dramatic. We spiked immediately up to about 12, 13% unemployment. I need to put that number in perspective. In 1929, at the onset of the Great Depression, our unemployment was 25% as a nation. So that gives you some comparative perspective. We had never seen unemployment higher than 8% in our region. Even when we had the epic recession in 2008, our unemployment went up to about 8-9%. That's where we were. So at the onset of the pandemic, boom, a spike upwards, and it hit about 12 or 13% in our region. But then almost as rapidly came down as we worked out protocols and figured out ways for people to work remotely and to hold jobs and to actually start revving up the economy again. So here, this puts it in sharper relief for you. I want you to know that as of right now, our unemployment rate is 2.9%. Now, that's where we were prior to the pandemic. Economists will tell you that anything in the twos is considered roughly full employment. So you can say that this economy is actually back to where it was. This is our jobs picture. This is showing you that Silicon Valley had a workforce of about 1.3 million at the end of the epic recession in 2008. And then it's showing you that every year thereafter, we had steady growth in the number of jobs, and you can see it. It was that nice staircase just going in that northeasterly direction, and then the pandemic sets in, and the pandemic immediately sacrificed 150,000 Silicon Valley jobs. 1 year ago, I stood on the same stage at State of the Valley and told you that we had made up 90,000 of those, but we still had about 60,000 jobs to make up. Well, guess what? We did it. There it is. That's what happened in the second half of 2021. So this is where the mercury's coming from. This is our good news story. You could say that this is an economy in full recovery. And in fact, that job number is actually 15,000 ahead. We added an extra 15,000 jobs in this past year, so that we're ahead of where we were when the pandemic set in March of 2020. Now, you might be curious about those jobs and where the extra increment came from. So here's a chart that's showing you that tech was actually the big driver. It always has been. Tech drives our economy, and people that are doing jobs in the technology sector, as it's narrowly defined, make up about 30% of our pie, just so you know. Now, that's a factor of the pandemic. Before the pandemic, tech was about a quarter of the pie. It's grown from a quarter to about 30%. So during the pandemic, understand, tech has grown. Silicon Valley tech has actually added to the workforce. But you should also know, looking at the pie, that there are the other classified jobs, which we classify as community infrastructure, and that includes it's a huge bucket. It includes retail and hospitality and healthcare and education and construction. All of those kinds of jobs make up this blue section of the pie, which is about half of the pie. And that segment of the pie has shrunk during the pandemic. And so we have to talk about that as well. So tech grew. Our local jobs in retail and establishments and frontline, those have actually shrunk by 4 percentage points. I want to drill in on tech for just a moment, just so you know. So one headline, tech growing, you got that. The second headline is just to see how it's growing. So in Silicon Valley, we're showing you how tech is composed. And it's about half of the employment is at 20 companies. We call them the top 20, the largest tech companies. And then the other half is spread across countless other tech companies of various sizes, but smaller sizes. Now, here's another headline. Our tech workforce is becoming more highly concentrated, and this shows you that. So more than half in 20 companies. And then, this is interesting, fully 13% of our tech workforce is at 2 companies. It's Google and Apple. That's a new development for the Valley. We used to be more spread out, more thinly spread over a large tech landscape. Now we're becoming a concentrated technology landscape. Now here's the other side of the pandemic picture. So I stood here and I told you, look, happy picture, jobs growing, we're ahead. That's a true story, but it's not the whole story. And we talked about how we're going to be looking at this through other lenses, and one lens would be this one right here, which is to tell you that the jobs that we lost and the jobs that we still haven't made up are in these sectors, the community infrastructure, and it includes accommodations, it includes transportation, arts. The arts are not recovering. Events are not happening like this one indoors. Oh, I forgot. I can take my mask off. Oh, I'm so happy to lose that. I was informed that I didn't have to be masked while I'm on stage because there's sufficient distance. Oh my gosh, that feels good. So these segments are down. They're actually down. And they're down by considerable percentages, 20%, even 30%. So even though I told you we're at full employment or 2.9% employment, it's not the case in these sectors. They are not recovering. And we're waiting for them to recover. Now, one way to think about it is, well, they will. They will recover as soon as we turn the lights back on and tell people that it's okay to go back to work and be indoors and to do things in person. We thought it might be that simple. It turns out it's not that simple. It's not going to be that simple. We can see that now. We don't have data, but we have a strong sense of this. Things have changed during the pandemic, and people are referring to it as the Great Resignation. There are jobs available in the retail sector that are not being filled, and it's because, we'll get to this, there is some flight out of the region, and we think some of that flight is people that feel like they just can't qualify any longer to be a member of this community, because the arithmetic doesn't pencil out. So that's part of the flight. Part of the flight is also techies working elsewhere, and we'll talk about that. But this sector not recovering, and they're calling it the Great Resignation. There are other demographic things happening as well. For example, baby boomers. The peak year for the baby boom generation was 1957. You know what that means? It means that now those boomers are ready for retirement. And guess what? A lot of them are saying, heck with it, I'm just going to retire now. This is good enough, and I'll cash out my house, and off I go. And so we're seeing that. We're going to be trying to document that. And then that means that the Gen Z has to come in to fill those jobs, but Gen Z has a different outlook on life. They think about work differently. They have a different set of criteria. And so there's an interesting mix and matching that's going on, and we'll be documenting that for you in coming indexes. Now, I want to go to this important question. If tech is our driver, then we want to know how is that going? How is the innovation engine going? And so I'm going to blow through some charts here that I think you'll find pretty astounding. For example, this one. This is the market cap. Let me remind you that market cap is all of the value of Silicon Valley's publicly held technology companies, the value of their shares on the markets. Well, when the pandemic set in, we had this immediate dive. You can see it here dramatically. And so we thought, boy, rough roads ahead. But actually, we were astonished to see this market cap not only recover, but reach new highs. So as of today, 14 trillion. 14 trillion is the value of the shares of our tech companies. Let me show you another amazing chart. This is venture capital. The amount of venture capital that we generated in our region over the past year, $95 billion. $95 billion. We have never seen anything like that in the history of venture capital in Silicon Valley. That's more by far than the dot-com craziness. And this chart, by the way, is inflation adjusted. So we're just blowing every record out of the water. We've never seen venture capital such as this. We command 72% of the state's venture capital, more than a third of the nation's venture capital. You might be curious where the venture capital is going. This chart shows you that it's going to the things that you would expect: software, platforms, architecture, mobile, telephony, all of these kinds of things. But I did want to highlight one emerging category because I think it tells an important story: transportation. There's major VC investment going into that sector, and that's a new story. That's become the 5th largest category now. And when I say transportation, I mean in particular autonomous vehicles and that entire newly emerging segment. So that's interesting. There's another interesting thing about venture capital: the advent of the mega deal. Take a look at this chart. In 2013, mega deals basically didn't exist. By mega deal, by the way, the definition is that it's a deal of more than $100 million. So in 2013, we were using what I call the old model, which is a lot of venture capital, but just spread thinly. just spread like the way you would spread bark over your garden, right? Then something happened. So look at this in the year 2021. Suddenly, we're doing mega deals. And by mega deals, actually, we should start referring to them as giga deals. These are billion-dollar investments going into certain companies. In Silicon Valley, we had 110 mega deals. In San Francisco, even more, 147 mega deals. So 213 of the deals, of all the deals out there, were mega deals. And you might be curious what some of them were. Well, Robinhood, you may have heard of them, democratizing the stock markets. Waymo, to my earlier point, Waymo is the Google offshoot, which is autonomous vehicles, and you know, they raked in all kinds of mega deals. Lacework is an Alviso company, which I thought was striking, and again, raking in these mega deals. It's a cloud services company. Neuro is another autonomous vehicle company. In this case, it's bringing robotics and autonomous delivery for goods and services. But I just want to point out that we're not only tech and futuristic stuff, we are also in the food industry. Look at that, Impossible Foods. Impossible Foods is a company that is bringing food alternatives for meat products and other things like that. So Silicon Valley may be in the process of disrupting the food industry. Now, here's the number of newly funded startups. We were worried for a time that there wasn't enough startup activity. We're not worried as of this year. Look at that, it's amazing. There's actually about close to 2,000 startups over the past 4 years. These are the ones that we can count because they have a paper trail. And so this is just robust, prodigious startup activity. It is interesting that there's more in San Francisco than Silicon Valley. That's been a trend for a couple of years. So we can talk about that. Now, the other interesting thing is to see the advent of so much angel activity. Angels, as you know, are investors. They are private investors. Sometimes they will pile on to a mega deal along with other VC investors, but more typically they will just be doing personal deals. And when there's a paper trail, we can measure them. And we see in the past year the advent of 2,200 discrete angel investors making discrete angel deals. So that's phenomenal growth. Now here's your IPO picture. Last year we had 32 IPOs. These are companies making an initial public offering on the stock markets. That's the biggest number we've seen this century. We haven't had this kind of activity. And then San Francisco had another 17 IPOs. So that's a lot. That's really quite amazing. What's also amazing is that those IPOs, four of those were Silicon Valley IPOs that made their debut at $1 billion. We've never seen something like that. And then there were 2 others in San Francisco. Roblox was one of them, Databricks, another, if I'm recalling correctly. Those 2 were also $1 billion right off the bat. So that's amazing. The other interesting thing is that the other IPOs haven't been performing as aggressively. And that's interesting. Last year's IPOs were bringing aggressive market returns to their investors. They've been slower this year. And in fact, the IPOs slowed down in the 4th quarter. So we'll be tracking that. DECACORNS is another measure of the innovation engine and how hot it is. DECACORNS, unicorns. We coined this term because it used to be that the phenomenon itself was so rare. Almost mythical, right? And so we called a private company valued at $1 billion a unicorn. Well, guess what? They're not mythical anymore. In Silicon Valley, we have 78 unicorn companies, 78. In San Francisco, there's another 135 of them. These are huge shares of the nation and the world. There's no other place that can make this statement. And then we coined the term decacorns, which means they're valued at $10 billion, and there's 17 of those in San Francisco right now. Silicon Valley had 3, but they all went public. And so we no longer have those 3 unicorns. Anyway, this is remarkable. Patents, I'll just quickly tell you, continues apace. You look at the chart and you think, well, it's a little off. We think that's actually a counting issue, again, related to the pandemic. It's taking longer to process the patents. So this number will be adjusted next year, and we suspect it'll be right in line. Related to all of this prodigious economic activity and growth is, of course, commercial real estate. And so we just want you to know that the vacancy rates didn't do what we expected during the pandemic. We thought there would be this thing going on. It hasn't happened. Actually, the vacancy is at healthy rates, and office space is filling. And I should also tell you that the major tech companies have not stepped away from their deals. They are still executing leases. They are still entering into ownership agreements. This chart on the right is showing you the amount of commercial space that's being occupied just by the large tech firms, and you can see that it continues to grow, and it has grown right through the pandemic. This is showing you the kinds of leases that we've been executing throughout the valley, and so you can see the growth trend there. This is showing you that there was a lag in 2020 while we were figuring out things, figuring out new protocols so that that construction could proceed. We figured that out, and you can see a rebound in 2021. We're still building, and we're still completing. And one trend that I would like to highlight is that a lot of it is for labs, highly specialized lab space. So that continues to be a major trend for Silicon Valley. And then here are the approvals. So this is your pipeline. These aren't built yet, but they've been approved, and it's massive amounts of approvals on the tune of about more than 16 million square feet has been approved. Now, a lot of this, if you're curious, is San Jose, one city. San Jose is going gangbusters, and then a lot of that has to do with the planned Google development in that part of San Jose. But there are others as well, and Santa Clara is on that list. So is Sunnyvale, with lots of industrial activity there. Okay, so. Now I want to actually change subjects, and I want to talk about the income picture. And just bear with me for one moment. My voice tends to go hoarse when I speak, and I'm working with a laryngologist right here at Stanford to try to improve the situation, but so far it's been profoundly inconsequential. So let's talk about how people are doing in Silicon Valley. We know that we're generating jobs. How are those jobs paying, and what does that picture look like? Well, here's Silicon Valley. This is just an astonishing figure. The average annual earnings in Silicon Valley is $170,000. Okay, that's everything, all in. That's all forms of compensation, including stock and options. But $170,000. Now compare that to the nation, which is it's about $70,000. So we're more than double the national average. Now there's a problem with averages, because we have so many high earners. So we track it many ways, and one way is per capita. So there's your per capita figures, 144,000. Still just dwarfs California, dwarfs the national average, which is 59. We think this is maybe a better measure, which is median household income. Remember, median means it's that breaking point. So half or more than that number, half or less than that number. And our median is $138,000. That's our median household income. And it's been growing. Just take a note of the trend. It's been growing steadily for many years running, and it continued to grow through the pandemic. So there's your income picture. Now, I have a profound responsibility in making this presentation. I need to tell you this. This is an important point. Averages do not tell you the real story. And Nicole said earlier how we're bringing a new equity lens to bear on figures such as this. I just want to be very clear. It's one thing to stand here on the stage and say averages, that wages grew by 10%. And that sounds like a really happy story, and I suppose it is. What it means is that the millionaire had an extra $100,000 to spend that year. But what it also means is that your frontline worker who is making $60,000 a year had an extra $6,000. That $6,000 is negligible. It's not a game changer. It does nothing in the lives of those families and individuals. So we need to be very clear about this when I show you a chart such as this, and we'll get into that more deeply in a bit. But right now I want to make another observation, which is to help us really understand how amazingly rich our region is. So we did some calculations. We know the personal liquid wealth of Silicon Valley's households. We actually have access to this information. Yes, we have your bank account, and that's the number. Personal liquid wealth means that you can access it. It's not tied up in a house or an investment or stock, that you could actually access it from your bank account, and the number is 735 billion. Then when you add the real estate, that's 432 billion. The total number is 1.2 trillion. So I wanted to put that number in perspective. So I went to look at GDP, and here it is. This is GDP from the IMF, from the United Nations, and from the World Bank. And if Silicon Valley were a country in terms of its wealth compared to the GDP, guess where it would rank? Number 15. It's just behind Spain. It's ahead of Mexico as a nation. It's ahead of the Netherlands. It's ahead of Switzerland. That's what we're talking about in terms of wealth in Silicon Valley. Now, this will give you a better picture on it. 15% of our top 15%, that's how they break out. 62% of that group has assets of about between 1 and 3 million. 5% of assets well above 10 million. And then you can look at the bottom half, and this chart is telling you that fully 18% have actually no assets, no savings. In fact, they might be in debt. So there's how it spreads out. I wanted to point out this. The top 10% of earners in Silicon Valley hold 75% of all the wealth. And the top quarter hold 92% of the wealth. The bottom quarter holds less than 2% of the wealth. Okay, I'm going to repeat that. Because I want to make sure we're really clear here. So households in the top quarter are holding 92% of the wealth in Silicon Valley. Households in the bottom half are holding just under 2% of the wealth. That's the place where we live. Now, economists study this very carefully. They're very interested in income distribution, wealth distribution, and they use a number of measures, and you'll see many of them in the index. But the most well-known is the Gini coefficient. So let me show you what the Gini looks like in Silicon Valley. Gini, just a quick refresher, is measured on a scale from 0 to 1, or you could say 0 to 100. And a Gini coefficient of 0 means that one person holds all the wealth. And a coefficient of 100 means that all of the people hold all of the wealth equally. Now, I actually got that backwards. Sorry about this. 0 means that all of the wealth is held equally. 1 means that one person holds all of the wealth. So you might be curious, the United States right now is about 60 on the Gini coefficient. That's driven, by the way, by Silicon Valley. We send that average up higher for the nation at large. Here's what the Gini looks like in the bigger picture. Over the past 10 years, the green line is Silicon Valley, so you can see dramatic movement up that Gini scale. So we've moved out of the 50s in Silicon Valley into the 70s. We're actually just shy of 70. Now, economists will tell you that anything above 70 is considered politically unstable. So really what you need to understand is that if Silicon Valley were a country, developmental economists would consider this to be an unstable country. Now I want to talk about that bottom half and that bottom quarter that I was highlighting on the chart. If you talk to anybody from the federal government, they will tell you that in Silicon Valley we are a relatively well-off society and that 5% of our population is living in poverty. 5%, that's what they'll tell you. That's because they're using a standard that defines poverty as mostly the cost of food. And it doesn't adjust for local conditions, including housing, the most important one. So we've actually abandoned the federal definitions in the Silicon Valley Index, and we have embraced a different set of definitions instead. It's called the Self-Sufficiency Index. It is the product of academics. And there's a team of them that are clustered at the University of Washington in a center there, and they have developed a very minute and granular index for measuring these kinds of things. And it's called the Self-Sufficiency Index, and our institute is working very closely with the social scientists at the University of Washington. And Nicole mentioned this. As a result of our partnership with the foundation, we're able to get more data than we have ever had before, and we're able to get more granularity. We can even get right down into neighborhoods. In fact, I'll show you some charts like that in a bit. But here's the top headline. In Silicon Valley, a third of our population, there it is, 32.7, do not meet self-sufficiency standards. That means that they require a form of assistance in order to survive. And that assistance comes from friends, family, a government program, or a church community. Okay, that's the region that we live in. It is a place where a third of our population is not self-sufficient. I wanted to show you this number, 44. That number is the percentage of Silicon Valley children who are living in homes that are not self-sufficient. So I'll just let you digest that for a moment. And this is the kind of granularity that we have for the first time in the index because of these new data partnerships. Okay, that's a real number. I didn't believe it when I saw it. I did not believe it. But I assure you that number is true. I'll be returning to this number in a bit. Now I wanted to talk about self-sufficiency in terms of wages. We've done some calculations with University of Washington, and we've determined that if you are a family that is one adult, one preschooler, and one infant, that in Silicon Valley, you have to have a salary above $150,000 just to be self-sufficient. That's factoring in your child care costs and your transportation and your taxes and your living expenses. So that's our calculation. And then at the bottom here, you'll see that we have calculated that if you are a two-adult family, let's say a husband and wife, and you are both working, but you have no children, then we think it's possible for you to get by on a little less than $50,000. By possible, I mean it means that you can pay your taxes and you can afford your grocery bill. It doesn't mean you can afford a Netflix account, but that's we're just looking at self-sufficiency. Now, I wanted to put that into the context of the minimum wage. The minimum wage in California is $15. So if you annualize that, that's $28,000. Nobody can live on the minimum wage, just to be clear. Silicon Valley cities, 19 of them have increased the minimum wage because, right? Good heavens, because. And so the highest in Silicon Valley would be San Jose, that's $16.40. They did that by ordinance, but that annualizes to $31,000. That's still not self-sufficiency. So you can't live in Silicon Valley on minimum wage. We think that the minimum wage would have to be $18.60. That would be the threshold for that couple that I described to actually afford all of their expenses in Silicon Valley. Now, the news gets worse because now we're dealing with inflation. And inflation is pretty considerable, the most we've ever seen. Inflation was about 6% since the pandemic set in. It had been 1.2% every year, but suddenly this dramatic increase. And it's happening across the board. This shows you that food is getting more expensive. Our household energy is getting more expensive. Cars are expensive. And in one category jumps out meat, poultry, fish, and eggs. Look at that, a 27% increase. Gasoline has increased by 36%. So that's really hard on these families that I'm describing. I will point out that the environmentalists and the climate activists will say, actually, that's great news. That's a great news indicator. We need to be raising the price of gasoline and nudging people towards electric alternatives. This was another thing that just astonished me. This is showing you the activity of food distribution programs, including joint ventures own. We have a food project that's capturing surplus food from Stanford, from Facebook, thank you, Dave, and redistributing that food. Anyway, this is a chart that's giving you a sense of all of that activity. But I was astonished by this. Second Harvest is now distributing more meals than the public sector. More meals than the state. The state had its food stamps program. It's now called CalFresh, but they are not distributing anywhere near as much as Second Harvest. I also just wanted to point out that the cost of childcare are spiking dramatically, more than the cost of inflation, and this is really hard on those self-sufficiency families that I was describing. Okay, here's another factoid that I wanted to highlight for you. And just another moment for my larynx. That's the number of people that are homeless in our region. We're defining that as the five-county region. It's a moving target, but I just wanted to tell you that Herculean efforts on the part of our agencies, our nonprofits, on the part of philanthropy, and yet there's the number, 30,000. That's spread across 5 counties, and 30,000, that's equivalent to the entire population of Menlo Park. That's how many people are homeless in our region. So speaking of homelessness, let's just talk about housing itself. How are we doing on housing? I'll go through this really quickly because you already know. You already know these things. We have the most expensive housing in the nation, bar none. There's no caveats, there's no fine print about that statement. The median home sale price last year was $1.3 million. And that median keeps rising. Our homes held their value and increased in value over the pandemic. We didn't expect that. We thought there would be a dip. It's not the case. So our real estate is still crazy. And the percentage of first-time home buyers who can afford, who can qualify for financing to buy the median-priced home, that number continues to drop. In Silicon Valley, it's now just 25% of first-time home buyers. Here are the rental rates. There is good news on the rent, which is that it's actually going down. The average price for a studio apartment in Silicon Valley is now about $2,000 a month, and that's been falling for about 2 years. The real question is, are we doing anything to add to our housing stock? That's the real question. And this chart is showing you that last year we issued 5,800 permits across the region. That's a small number. That's a really small number. It's not really a drop in the bucket when you talk about the housing need. Nevertheless, it's progress. We're making some progress. We also approved, this chart is showing you that we approved 15,000 new units. The difference between permits and approvals, permits means they actually took out the permits and the construction is beginning. This is how many we have approved. And so we're envisioning 15,000 more units spread across the 39 Silicon Valley cities, and that's progress. And it's also hopeful that so much of the development is adjacent to transit, so that these people can have a transit-oriented lifestyle. This chart is showing you that of all of those newly approved units, they're not necessarily affordable. What we're really good at building in Silicon Valley is luxury housing. We're building a lot of that. But of all of those 15,000 that we approved, only 12% of those will be affordable to people that are making the median wage. So that's difficult. You may have heard of the RHNA assessment. It stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. These are targets that are dictated to us by the state. And look at this. We're actually making progress towards the state allocation. But guess what? This allocation will be over in a year. And the new allocation is even more aggressive. And it's pretty doubtful that we'll meet it because we didn't meet this one, and it's hard to imagine that we'll meet the next one. By the way, here's how we're doing when you break down the assessments by category. We are meeting it for homes that are above the average income, but we are falling dramatically short for low-income housing, moderate housing, and very low-income housing. I mean, just not even close. Not happening in our region. A brief word about transportation. We could talk about this at length. I think that there's actually not much that you need to know because you already know it. You sense it. You know all these things intuitively. But here's a chart that was showing you that we're all in love with driving. We typically drive to work, and we drive alone. And that's been the case. But the big development since the pandemic is that 29% that you see in the far right-hand bar. That's the people that are no longer driving. They're working from home. And so the hope is that as we recover and enter our new life in an endemic, that we'll actually be able to capture a good portion of those 29%. That maybe all of us will continue working from home, or that we'll continue working from home some days of the week. And if we do, that makes a considerable difference on the roadways. This is showing you daily hours of congestion. It was just climbing, just kept climbing. It had been climbing for decades. And then you can see the dramatic drop when we started to shelter. And folks are saying, oh, it's all back because the roads seem crowded again. Your memory is faulty. It's not. It's not. Yeah. The congestion at the roadways is a fraction of what it was prior to the pandemic. And so the hope is that we can somehow build on that with these new models. But I think this is the more important story, or the more troubling story, thank you, that our per capita transit use is way down, way down. And it's probably not going to recover anytime soon. Here's what happened to Caltrain. Caltrain is, my goodness, it had a 92% drop in ridership, and their revenues are off 58% this year, and they're in the hole $44 million right now. Okay, I'm actually going to skip over this. We'll come back to it if it's time, but I am running out of time, and so I want to talk about the most important thing, the thing that we promised you at the beginning, which is to look at Silicon Valley through an equity lens. So in my remaining minutes, we are going to ask these very hard questions. We used to feel really good about Silicon Valley because we're such a diverse region, and we are. We're the nation's most diverse region. And this shows you, we're no longer a majority white population. The majority now is actually, we're not a majority population, but the largest segment is Asians, 29%, and followed by white, and then followed by Hispanic, and then followed by the others. So we're very diverse, and 51% of our population speaks an a language other than English at home. But here, as we dive more deeply, okay, this was the old story. We used to say, we're diverse, isn't that wonderful? But it actually turns out that our neighborhoods are not diverse. I'm going to show you this. Green means that you're living in a neighborhood that is diverse. And we have this by census tract right down to the neighborhood. And so green means that your neighbors don't look like yourself. That's what it means. And that's what we looked like in 1980. Look at all of that green space. And then 10 years later, we were starting to lose that green space. And then 10 years later, look at all of that red. That's what happened to us. And then 10 years later, that's what we look like. And then we're still updating the 2020. We'll have that to you next year. But look at that. We are, yes, a diverse region, but we are also a segregated region. That's one finding in the index this year. Now, here is the share of adults that are educated, have a bachelor's degree, and we're a highly educated region. We've always been proud of that. But this chart is showing you that there's persistent disparities by race, that our white and Asian members are highly educated, our Black or African Americans are not, and nor are Hispanic, Latino, and the other ethnicities. There is a steep chasm there differentiating those groups. The same is true for high school dropout rates. We can do this. They shot up when the pandemic set in, but they didn't shoot up at the same rate across ethnic groups. The highest was for our Hispanic and Latino school children, followed by Pacific Islanders, then followed by African Americans. And these are pretty dramatic figures. Now here's wages, and of course we're proud that we're a high wage region, but there are wage disparities, and this chart is showing them to you. There you can see that white, not Hispanic, are commanding the highest wages in Silicon Valley, and you can see that our Hispanic brothers and sisters, our Black and African Americans, are not commanding the same wage. We thought that was, we've long been concerned about the disparity, but here's what I want to highlight for you. It turns out that the theory that, that education can change the game isn't actually playing out in Silicon Valley, because look at this. There is a wage gap between the races at the same level of education. And let me highlight that for you. Hispanic or Latino residents make an average wage that is 64% less than educated white residents. That's astounding. And same can be said at the rate of 50% for our Black or African American residents. That's astounding. Now, I told you about how we're a third of our population not meeting self-sufficiency. But look what happens when we break that down for you by race and ethnicity. It's a very bleak story. And this is the thing that we need to focus our sights upon. So if you are a Hispanic or Latino household, it's actually 61% of those households are not meeting self-sufficiency standards. And And then you can see similar, it's about 40% for our Black or African American households. And then if you're not speaking English, it's a more dire picture. It's upwards of 90% are not self-sufficient. And if you're a single mother, oh my gosh, this chart is telling you that you're in an impossible situation. Now, I told you this number, 44% of our children are living in homes that are not self-sufficient. Now, here's what that looks like when we break it down by race and ethnicity. So our Latino households are making up about 53%. So 53% of that figure is accounted for by our Latino households, followed by Asian Pacific Islanders, and there's your reality. That's what we need to be talking about at the same time that we're talking about these other things. Now, the hope has always been that tech can be a ladder. It can be something that helps people change their lives and open the door to opportunities. But look at this. The leadership roles at the largest 20 companies are being filled for the most part by white members of our community, and followed by Asian members of our community. And then only 5% of them are being filled by Hispanic or Latino members, and even less for our Black and African American members. This is what our population looks like. Remember, our Latino population is 24%. It's 24% of the population, but in tech, it is 5% in the leadership roles. So this is also a part of our stark reality. This is a chart that's showing you that we estimate that 39% of the jobs can be done remotely, all the jobs out there. But when you look at the share of our workforce that are Hispanic or Latino, we estimate that only 23% of those jobs could be filled remotely. All the rest have to be done in person, which has meant, I'm skipping over this really quickly, has meant that there's been uneven exposure to the disease. And our people filling those frontline jobs, they are disproportionately Latino, Hispanic, and other races other than white. And it meant that they were making impossible choices. Do I stay home and forego wages, or do I work but expose myself to the disease? And as a result, this chart is telling you that Hispanic and Latino members were dying from the disease at a rate 3 times that of white. And if you're Black or African American, you were dying from the disease at a rate twice that of our white members. I'm out of time, and I want to keep us on time, so I'm just going to tell you that there are also troubling indicators about infant mortality rates. There are also troubling indicators about C-sections at the time of birth. There's also troubling indicators about adults feeling safe in their neighborhoods. In fact, I'll end on this one. We have data asking whether you feel safe at home, where you live. And look, precipitous drops. Our white community members feel reasonably safe, although it dropped. Our Latino and Hispanic members suddenly do not feel safe over the past 10 years. They've dramatically dropped. And then this chart is showing you how 7th graders feel at school. Do they feel safe at school? And over that same 10-year period, they have come to feel less safe in their school environment. You can see that people experiencing anxiety or depression also exhibit disparities by race. And then I'll actually end with this. We're making progress on the electoral front. In other words, we're electing people from underrepresented communities in higher levels than before, but we're not home yet. For example, imagine if you are, let's say, a Black or African American member of our community, you would hope that there was somebody that looks like you on the city council and who has had your same shared life experience. It's actually not the case. We only have African American elected representatives on 11 of our Silicon Valley cities. That means that the other 28 have no African American representation. So we have miles to go. That's it, I'm completely out of time. There's so much more that we could talk about. Let me just say this. This is a prodigious region. There's no other region like it on the face of the planet. I should also say that there are more resources here, more talent, more intelligence, and more will to address the kinds of problems that we've elucidated today if there is a way for us to come together in new partnerships and new combinations, and that's my hope for this region that we call home. Thank you very much.